Your 20-minute FTP testing is pointless, and in this video I'm going to show you what you should use instead. My name's Tremayne. I'm an Australian professional triathlete. I went from Olympic weightlifting to professional triathlete in less than 3 years. I did it entirely self-coached, and now I help other athletes race faster by running stronger off the bike. So if you're at all interested, my coaching services are below. If you're not interested, watch this video all the way through. This will be the most fundamental principle around how to individualize your training and why you shouldn't use FTP testing or 5K time trials in order to create your training prescriptions for a new block. So without any further ado, let's get into the video. Bang, sick transition. So what is this magical thing I'm talking about? Well, it is the power duration curve. The power duration curve is simply your maximal powers, or if you have the software for it, it is your mean maximal power. So in this particular software that we use in-house at Tremayne Performance, I use the mean of your top 5 power or pace outputs at a given duration, and we plot that on a graph from 5 seconds all the way out to 3 hours. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about the power duration curve because it's way easier and the data is heaps cleaner. Run duration curves work. However, just because of the way GPS records data, they tend to be a lot less reliable, especially across the shorter durations than the bike. So run can still be used, and everything I say in this video applies to the run. It's just you got to be a little bit more careful about what data you use. So why is this curve better than using a 20-minute test? Well, I always like to come back to something called first principles, which is boiling down a topic to the most basic, undisputable facts of that topic and then building from there. The reason this curve is so strong is this is a direct reflection of what you've done in training and your ability at the point in time that we export this data. The FTP test suffers from what I call the Chinese whispers effect, which is we basically started with a lab study. We then observed a population of people and how their 60-minute power correlated to their 20-minute. We then took a broad spectrum coefficient from quite a small sample size. We then try to apply that coefficient to athletes in the field who aren't even in the lab setting. And then we try and use that coefficient to create training prescriptions and monitor improvement. You see how we're kind of like 4 or 5 stages removed from the original lab study that was conducted? That's the reason I don't like it. Now, obviously, all of that applies to a 5K time trial. And unfortunately, where I think all of this came from is Joe Friel's training Bibles, because he sort of preaches the 20-minute test and the 5K TT. And those books were written like 30 or 40 years ago. So I just don't think with the tech we have now and the ability to analyze data in a heartbeat, we should still be using stuff like that. My other issue with 20-minute FTP, which I promise I'll try and keep this rant short, is I think it's just hyper marketable. It's really easy to get outrageous improvements from athletes using the 20-minute test, because if I get a fresh athlete in and I ask them to jump on a bike immediately with no training whatsoever and do a 20-minute FTP, one, they're going to be weak as piss because they don't even have the motor unit recruitment available. 2, they're going to mispace the test and more than likely blow up and not extract the max result they can. And then if I just test that a year later, it's like so easy to get like 100-watt improvement or something like that. I would just be skeptical of any coach whose Instagram is full of like training improvements as opposed to race results. I think on my Instagram, you'll find one lactate result, which was from a lactate step test. The rest of my improvements are race results. Now, I've had some obscene power duration curve improvements, but I don't really post them because they don't mean anything if the athlete doesn't go faster on race day. Make sense? Anyway, side tangent. Just don't trust the 20-minute FTP and the 5K TT. That's all I'm going to say. What do we actually do with this thing and how do we read it? So for context, this is my profile from a few weeks ago. I was in preparation for a 70.3, which was 70.3 West Sydney. I did have a good race, but this was about 2 weeks out from that. So it's about 7 weeks out from Ironman Cairns. Now, this is an incredibly flat profile. Incredibly flat. This is very well optimized for an Ironman. And unfortunately, I would potentially say this was too flat for 7 weeks out. Now, it was a bit awkward the way I had to factor in some racing around it, but I will say I've probably made a slight mistake in my own training in that maybe I should have been willing to go into West Sydney with a steeper curve and then optimize it for Ironman Cairns, which is sort of my A race. We get this curve. What are the things we can do with it? So you've just loaded up your curve for your last 10 weeks of training. What are the options? So I'm going to put this in the context of post Cairns because this curve will likely stay pretty similar for me for the next few weeks. And then post Cairns, I'm going to explain what I can do with it. And you can hopefully use that example to factor that into your own training. So immediately post Cairns, we're going into a bit more of a short duration power focused block. So when looking at this curve, I would think about short, medium, and long duration power. So short duration power is probably going to be anything sub 5-ish minutes around that VO2 max power. Medium duration power is going to be sort of that 5 through to 20 or 30 minute power where it's still obviously very aerobic, but it is primarily a glycolytic effort and specifically an anaerobically dominated glycolytic effort. And then we've got the longer duration power, which is sort of that post 30 minute to infinity power. So coming out of Cairns, I'm going to take an easy week because I think I've done 16 or 17 weeks of training with 2 races and no deloads in there because I felt pretty strong the whole way through. So I will take a rest week. But then we're going to get straight into focusing on this short duration power because the medium's a bit average, the long is really strong, the short is terrible. So I will actually include a couple of sprints, which I don't do for triathletes too often, but I'll definitely just see if I can get back to cracking like 1,000 watts for a sprint. I'm going to probably do a VO2 max session maybe once per week for a period of 6 or 7 weeks. And I'm only going to do sub-threshold work, maybe once a fortnight to once every 3 weeks, like an extensive sub-threshold workout, just to maintain as much of this back end as possible. Because, and we'll get into it in a sec, you don't want to pivot the curve, you want to try and grow the curve where possible. Sometimes people overcomplicate this topic in the sense that, and I actually used to do this, you really hammer in on pivoting because it kind of makes you feel smart in the sense that you're extracting a better result in a race from not as good of a top end. You know, it's going to be way easier to add 20 watts to just your 3-hour power than to add 20 watts across all durations. So the fastest way to improve in an Ironman is just to target like the 3-hour power or the 1-hour power and focus on flattening the curve. I'll include a little bit of extensive work to try and maintain this bottom end. And largely what I'm looking to do is maintain as best I can this bottom end sort of past 30 minutes onwards and really substantially grow 30 minutes and below, and especially grow 5 minutes and below. So then you would probably end up with a curve that kind of comes like this and then drops off and then hopefully doesn't drop below where this blue line sits right now. So then we've done one block, we do an adaptation week, we pretty much cut most of the intensity from the week, we recover, I review my block. Actually, let's for argument's sake put in my curve from a couple years ago when my top end was quite strong. Ignore the green line that's lower here, but let's just assume now my curve looks like this and it kind of forms into the blue line. So we've now got this straight line, I've maintained the bottom end, and now I've got this much nicer looking top end. What I want to do from here is I'm going to try and grow the curve. So I would like to move this entire line, keep its exact shape, and have the whole thing lift up. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a balanced program. So I'm going to equally target VO2 max or short duration power, equally target medium duration power, equally target long duration power. And after 6 weeks, I'm going to see what happens. Now, let's say, in fact, let me just use that profile just because it's a better shape. Okay, sorry, I'll say if it grows, great. Just repeat basically the program you did already. I know that sounds silly and people don't want to hear it. You can maybe mix up the interval lengths a little bit, but largely just keep the program the exact same and run it again for 6 weeks. Like, don't fix what's not broken. But let's say this curve doesn't move for 6 weeks. Well, now I'm going to try and target a specific area of the curve. So now we've got this great big top end. Okay, let's say the curve doesn't move at all. What are we going to do then? I'm probably going to go back to focusing on the shorter duration power again, potentially even more aggressively than last time. So again, I'm going to do some neuromuscular work. I'm going to do a good amount of VO2 max work, and I'm just going to do maintenance on the long duration. I'm going to make this curve even steeper. This is the important part. This is kind of where the art comes in. Hopefully what happens is this top end moves up and this back end stays the same. If this back end drops because we've moved the top end, there is a very, very good chance I need to add volume to my training, whether that is increasing the amount of time spent at higher intensities, or whether that is just generally, ideally, we would just add duration. But I understand for age groupers, sometimes most of the time your lifestyle constricted in terms of your schedule, as opposed to like having a physiological constraint. So you may not have the hours to just add in. But ideally, we are going to try and turn over more work, however that might be. And that's a discussion you would have to have with yourself or with your coach. So if the curve, if to increase our ability in one domain, we end up nuking the other end of the spectrum, we know we probably need more volume. We've probably maxed out our ability on that volume. So then the decision I would make is I would return to a balanced program, but with more volume. And then again, we'd look to see if the curve grows. And that should be pretty simple. If I do this top end focus block though, and I increase the short duration power and the long duration power stays the same, then I'm going to be happy to then go back into a more medium to long duration focus block and lift the efficiency again. And again, if we lift the efficiency and maintain the top end, then we can keep going. But if we lift the back end and we drop the top end, well, we need more volume. I hope that makes sense. So the scenarios you can get is grow the curve, great, do it again. If you pivot the curve, if you grow in one domain, well, then you can probably move to the other domain and see if you can increase the utilization or just increase the ceiling. Like you can pick one of the domains. If it doesn't, if raising the power in one domain doesn't negatively affect the other domains, then you can switch the focus again to either increase the top end or increase the efficiency and just keep kind of going like that, if that makes sense. If you, however, negatively impact the other domains, then we need to look at adding volume. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Hopefully you guys enjoy this channel, because this channel is actually just going to be me yap maxing at my computer. Because one of the reasons I hate short form content is I've never once posted a piece of short form content that I felt was finished. So really the goal here is just literally word vomit and put it on YouTube and see if anybody wants to watch. So anyway, this is the application I use now. Like, I'm not going to give this out, but I will say, like, I built this in Claude in a couple of days. If you, like, I just vibe coded the shit out of this. You could probably build something similar if you really wanted to. Like, I'm not going to pretend that I'm some sort of like expert level developer. But if you don't have this, what can you use? Well, you can use the power duration curves in Training Peaks. Now, I'm not going to cover this for too long. I'm just going to give my brief rundown of how I would use this. The way I would do it, so the disadvantages of the Training Peaks one are it's not going to be a mean max power or pace curve. It is just going to be a max pace or power curve, which means you are subject to just like random sort of abnormalities in the data. Versus my application takes the top 10 efforts across the given duration and then plots them on the graph. This will just take the one. The way I would start though, there's two ways you could start. The first is if you have a friend, which I know would definitely put me out of this category. If you have a friend and you both want to learn this together, just literally take your curves have a look at them side by side and go, you are stronger across this domain, I'm stronger across this domain. And then both target your weaknesses and then see what happens. Pretty simple. If you can't do this, what I would do is I would set your main chart to be every to be the last like 90 days or 3 months, last 3 months, and then set your comparison chart to be the last 2 years. That way you can kind of see your all-time peaks relative to what you've done in training in the last 3 months, which then makes it really easy for you to go, okay, what am I strong at right now comparative to what needs to be worked on? You do need to take some of this with a grain of salt because, like, for example, I know for a fact I can push more than my all-time 3-hour power right now. I just haven't done it. I guarantee you post Ironman, I will dominate this number, but I haven't done any straight up 3-hour efforts at or above Ironman race pace. But what does make a lot of sense is that I'm absolutely nuked out of my mind on this top end around both. So I would know that post cans, I need to come in and steepen this curve. Once let's say you do one training block where you've targeted a specific point of the curve, you can come in, you can set the dates to custom. So you can set your last 6 weeks of training and then the 6 weeks before that, or the 10 weeks of training and 10 weeks before that. And now you've got 3 graphs you can compare to. Unfortunately, you can't put all 3 on here, but you could compare your current last 6 weeks to the 6 weeks before that to your all-time. And now you're starting to compare graphs and sort of see how the training influences the graph. So yeah, I hope if you've gotten this far in the video, you are never going to do an FTP test ever again. I promise you, taking the time to learn how the power duration curve works, and more importantly, which maybe we'll cover in another video, how your training actually influences the power duration curve, and just repeating that skill, this is more valuable than learning any sort of specific workout, learning any sort of special training methodology. Like, there's nothing you can learn that will beat this skill, because if you have your core set of 10 sort of workouts that you'd like to do across the bike and the run, and you learn to understand how those different workouts influence the power duration curve or the pace duration curve, you will become, and then knowing when to add volume, when to pivot the curve, when to grow the curve, when to do all these sorts of things, I promise you'll be ahead of pretty much every coach on the market, obviously excluding me. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Hope this is really informative. I hope you like this style of video. Please leave a comment if you have any questions about anything I covered in the video, or please feel free to leave any critiques. And yeah, as I said, if you want to work with me, my coaching information is below if you'd like me to just do this for you and you'll get way better, way faster. But if not, take this video, run with it. Please ask me any questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.